The front door had barely stopped shaking from the force with which my husband slammed it when I heard something behind me that made the blood drain from my face. For 3 months, everyone in our house had watched my mother-in-law lie motionless in a hospital-style bed, unable to speak clearly, unable to walk, and supposedly unable to move anything except her eyes. My husband had insisted that her stroke had taken away almost everything she once was. I had believed him. I had fed her, bathed her, changed her clothes, massaged her stiff hands, and slept beside her room whenever she cried through the night. But 15 minutes after my husband left me with divorce papers and a warning that I would never see him again, the woman everyone called helpless slowly pushed her blanket aside, placed both feet on the floor, stood up without assistance, and looked directly at me. Her voice was weak, but perfectly understandable. She said, "We have to leave before he comes back." I could not breathe. I stared at her as though I had suddenly entered a nightmare. The woman who supposedly could not stand had just stood in front of me. The woman who supposedly could barely speak had just spoken an entire sentence. And somehow, I knew that whatever she was about to tell me would change everything I thought I knew about my marriage. Before we uncover the secret that kept an entire family trapped in fear, please take a moment to like this story, share it with someone who believes in kindness and second chances, leave a comment telling us where you're listening from, and subscribe to Kindness Speaks if you believe that sometimes the person who looks weakest may be the one carrying the greatest truth. My name is Claire, and until that afternoon, I had spent 7 years believing that marriage meant staying when things became difficult. I had met Daniel when I was 27, working long hours at a small accounting office and barely earning enough to keep my apartment. He had been charming, confident, and patient. He told me that his mother, Eleanor, was the most important woman in his life, and I admired him for loving her so deeply. When we married, Eleanor welcomed me with a smile that seemed sincere. She had raised Daniel alone after his father died, and I respected the sacrifices she had made. For the first few years, our marriage was ordinary in the most beautiful way. We cooked together, took weekend drives, argued over silly things, and dreamed about having a family. Then Eleanor suffered what Daniel described as a devastating stroke. He called me from the hospital one rainy evening, his voice trembling, telling me that his mother might never walk again. I rushed there and found Eleanor staring silently at the ceiling, one side of her body seemingly lifeless. Daniel was devastated. He cried into my shoulder and begged me to help him care for her. I promised I would. I never imagined that promise would eventually cost me almost everything. The first months were exhausting, but I did not complain. I learned how to prepare her meals according to the doctor's instructions. I learned how to transfer her carefully from bed to wheelchair. I washed her hair, clipped her nails, changed her bedding, and spent hours reading aloud because Daniel said she liked hearing my voice. At first, Daniel helped. Then gradually, his work became more demanding. He began coming home later. He said he was under pressure at the office. He said he was trying to earn enough money to pay for his mother's care. I understood. Whenever I asked him whether we should hire a professional caregiver, he became defensive and said we could not afford one. So I took on more. Eventually, caring for Eleanor became almost entirely my responsibility. I stopped seeing friends. I stopped going to the gym. I postponed my own career plans. I became so tired that sometimes I would sit on the kitchen floor after everyone was asleep and cry quietly because I did not recognize the woman I had become. But Eleanor always watched me. Her eyes followed me around the room with an intensity one could never explain. She could not speak more than a few broken sounds, according to Daniel. Sometimes she tried to lift her hand, but it would fall back onto the blanket. Sometimes she made noises that sounded like frustration. Daniel told me not to expect too much. He said her brain had been damaged and that she might never recover. I accepted his explanation because I loved him. That was my first mistake. The second mistake was believing every excuse that came afterward. Daniel started criticizing everything I did. If Eleanor coughed at night, he blamed me for not checking on her sooner. If she refused food, he said I was preparing it incorrectly. If I mentioned how exhausted I was, he accused me of being selfish. Then he began controlling our finances. The bank accounts that had once been shared became complicated and inaccessible. Statements stopped arriving at the house. Whenever I asked questions, he told me not to worry about things I did not understand. I wanted to believe him. I kept telling myself that difficult seasons passed. I told myself that if I stayed patient, my marriage would return to the way it had been. Then I found the envelope. It was hidden behind a stack of old medical papers in Daniel's study. I had been searching for an insurance document when the envelope fell onto the floor. Inside were copies of financial statements, property documents, and several medical records. My hands shook as I read them. The house we lived in was not solely Daniel's. Eleanor had purchased it years before our marriage and had transferred a significant portion of ownership into a family trust. There were also records showing payments to a private rehabilitation clinic, yet Eleanor had never been taken there. Instead, the money had been withdrawn from an account connected to her medical care. I confronted Daniel that evening. He became furious. He snatched the papers from my hands and accused me of invading his privacy. He told me I was imagining things. He said the documents were complicated and that I was incapable of understanding them. Then he gave me a choice: stop asking questions or leave the house. I stayed. Not because I trusted him anymore, but because something inside me had begun to whisper that there was a truth buried beneath everything I had been told. Over the next few weeks, I started paying attention to details. I noticed that Eleanor's medication changed whenever Daniel was away. I noticed that her right hand, which supposedly had no strength, sometimes moved when she thought no one was watching. I noticed that she could track conversations with her eyes even when Daniel insisted she could not understand them. Most strangely, whenever I mentioned leaving the house, Eleanor's expression changed. Fear appeared in her eyes. One night, while Daniel was away on a business trip, I sat beside Eleanor's bed and whispered that I was sorry. I told her I felt trapped. I told her I did not know what to do anymore. Eleanor stared at me for several seconds. Then, slowly, she moved one finger. She pointed toward the nightstand. I opened the drawer. Inside was nothing except an old photograph. It showed Eleanor, Daniel, and another man standing outside a large building. On the back was a date from 20 years earlier and a handwritten note. I could not understand its meaning, but I recognized the building. It was the headquarters of the company Daniel now claimed to own. That was when I realized his story might be much bigger than our marriage. The next morning, Eleanor looked at me differently. She squeezed my hand. It was weak, but deliberate. I asked her if she was trying to tell me something. She moved her eyes toward the hallway. Then she shook her head. Someone was coming. Daniel entered the room. Immediately, Eleanor's body became still. The change was so dramatic that my stomach turned. She lowered her hand and stared blankly at the ceiling. Daniel looked at me and asked why I was sitting beside her so early. I told him I had trouble sleeping. He watched me for several seconds, then smiled in a way that did not reach his eyes. That was the first moment I became genuinely afraid of my husband. A few days later, everything collapsed. Daniel came home carrying a folder. He placed it on the kitchen table and told me our marriage was over. There was no apology. No explanation. No attempt to repair anything. He simply said that he had already spoken to a lawyer and that I needed to sign the papers. I asked him where I was supposed to go. He told me that was no longer his concern. Then he accused me of neglecting his mother and said he had enough evidence to make sure I received nothing. I felt something inside me break. After 7 years, he could erase me with a folder. I asked him how he could do this after everything I had sacrificed. He said sacrifices did not make me entitled to his life. Then he walked toward the bedroom, gathered a suitcase, and left. The door slammed. Silence filled the house. I stood in the hallway staring at the divorce papers. 15 minutes later, I heard a sound behind me. A soft scrape. I turned. Eleanor was standing. For several seconds neither of us moved. She was pale and trembling. Her knees were unsteady, but she was standing on her own. Then she took one slow step toward me. Then another. I covered my mouth to stop myself from screaming. She reached the kitchen table, placed both hands against it, and whispered the sentence that changed my life. "We have to leave before he comes back." I began crying immediately. I asked her how long she had been able to walk. She looked toward the door and then told me the truth. The stroke had been real, but her recovery had been far greater than Daniel wanted anyone to know. She had discovered months earlier that Daniel was secretly transferring money from accounts she controlled. When she confronted him, he threatened to place her in a permanent care facility and take control of her finances. He had convinced doctors and relatives that she was more impaired than she actually was. He had also made her dependent on him for medication and transportation. She was terrified that if she resisted, he would make sure she disappeared into a facility where no one would believe her. So she pretended. She pretended not to understand. She pretended not to walk. She pretended not to speak. And she waited. She waited for someone she could trust. That someone had been me. I could hardly accept what I was hearing. All those months, I had thought I was caring for a helpless woman. I had not realized that she had been silently observing everything. She had seen Daniel manipulate me. She had watched me lose myself. She had watched me defend him even when he treated me cruelly. Then she told me the part that hurt the most. She had been trying to protect me. She explained that the money Daniel had been stealing was not his. It belonged to a charitable foundation she had created years earlier. The foundation supported families struggling with long-term medical care. Daniel had been draining it through fake contracts and shell companies. The financial documents I found were only a fraction of what he had done. And there was something else. Eleanor had proof. She had hidden copies of the original documents in a place Daniel had never searched. We left the house through the back door. I helped Eleanor into my car, and for the first time in months, she sat beside me not as a patient, but as a woman who had chosen to fight. We drove to a small hotel and contacted a lawyer she trusted. Within hours, everything changed. The lawyer reviewed the documents, contacted authorities, and began protecting Eleanor's assets. The divorce papers Daniel had presented were suddenly meaningless compared with the evidence against him. But the emotional damage could not be erased with paperwork. For weeks, I struggled with guilt. I kept thinking about every moment I had ignored my instincts. I wondered how I could have loved someone who had manipulated both me and his own mother. Eleanor never blamed me. Instead, she told me that being deceived did not make me foolish. It made me human. Those words stayed with me. Months passed. The investigation revealed that Daniel had been hiding debts and moving money through several accounts. The medical care he claimed to be paying for had been exaggerated, and some of the records had been manipulated. His carefully constructed image began to collapse. But the greatest surprise came from Eleanor. She did not use her money to punish him. Instead, she expanded her foundation. She created a program that provided temporary financial assistance and professional caregivers to families looking after relatives recovering from serious illnesses. She said she never wanted another exhausted spouse or frightened child to feel as trapped as I had felt. She also offered me a position. Not because she owed me. Because she believed I had discovered something inside myself. I had spent years believing my worth came from being a good wife. Eleanor helped me understand that my worth existed long before anyone called me a wife, and it would remain long after that marriage ended. A year later, I stood beside her at the opening of a new community care center. Eleanor walked to the podium without a wheelchair. She was not completely recovered. She still moved slowly, and one side of her body remained weaker than the other. But she was standing. And so was I. When I looked at her, I realized the most powerful part of our story was not that she had fooled everyone by pretending to be weaker than she was. It was that two women who had both been trapped in different ways had found the courage to save each other. Daniel eventually tried to contact me. I never answered. Not because I hated him. Because I had finally learned that forgiveness did not require reopening a door that had nearly destroyed me. I forgave him from a distance. I forgave myself up close. And Eleanor became more than my former mother-in-law. She became family. Years later, when people asked me how I had survived the darkest period of my life, I always remembered that afternoon. 15 minutes after my husband walked away, I thought my life was ending. I believed I had been abandoned, humiliated, and left with nothing. But sometimes the ending we fear is actually the beginning we desperately need. Sometimes the person we think we are saving is secretly saving us. Sometimes the strongest person in the room is the one everyone has underestimated. And sometimes, life waits until the door closes behind the person who hurt us before finally showing us the door we were meant to walk through. If this story touched your heart, please take a moment to like the video, share it with someone who may need hope today, and subscribe to Kindness Speaks. Your support helps these stories reach people who need a reminder that difficult chapters do not have to become the final chapter of their lives. If you believe that kindness can give someone the courage to begin again, let us know by staying with us and sharing this story. And before we end, I have one special request for you. Comment. I choose courage over fear. If you believe that sometimes losing someone is the beginning of finding yourself, your comment may be the exact words another person needs to see today. Claire never forgot that afternoon. She never forgot the sound of the door closing. She never forgot the fear she felt when she believed she had been left with nothing. But most of all, she never forgot the sight of an older woman, trembling on unsteady legs, standing in the middle of the kitchen and quietly saying, "We have to leave." Because that moment taught her the greatest lesson of her life. You are not finished just because someone walks away from you. You are not powerless because someone has convinced you that you are. And you are never truly alone when you finally find the courage to stand. Sometimes the first step toward freedom is simply standing up. And sometimes, all it takes is one brave person standing beside you.